Good evening, everyone. I know it doesn't feel like a good evening, but it's a really good evening when all of us get together for a conversation like this. So good evening, everyone. That's better. Welcome to a community conversation about humanity and human rights, about kindness and caring, values. It's values that make a great nation. I am Geeta Pradhan, the president of the Cambridge Community Foundation, your local giving platform to support shared prosperity, social equity, and cultural richness in the city we all love. Tonight's discussion, Lives in Limbo, Immigration as a Human Rights Issue, is part of a series of programs and efforts that express our community's position. Cambridge stands with residents. I hope you all got your little, yes. For decades, the foundation has worked in the area of immigrant rights in partnership with local nonprofits and donors. And seeing the overwhelming need for immigrant defense, we partnered in March with Mayor McGovern to launch the Cambridge Legal Defense Fund for nonprofits. Since that time, the urgency of the immigration crisis has continued to deepen. From DACA, which actually led to the creation of the fund, to temporary protection status workers, to asylum seekers, to the heart-wrenching issue of separating parents from their children, and now the Muslim ban. Concerned citizens across our city have responded to the need. The foundation seeded the fund with a $50,000 grant, and we recently received a $50,000 matched grant challenge from the Lewis Foundation. With your support, we've now tripled our commitment. 233 donors have given to the fund. Many of you are here tonight to join with others to learn and share. And there have been community events all month to bring attention to the need for action. With almost 150,000 raised and more coming, we will put your money to work right away. In August, grants will go out to local nonprofits to pay for the legal defense costs for immigrant families. I want to thank you for this. I want to thank the Why Wait Fund and the Johnson Family Fund for sponsoring this event. And again, thank you all really for your contributions, your kindness, and your humanity. I also want to say a huge thanks to Mayor McGovern and his staff, particularly Anna Barrows, who's somewhere back there, who's worked really hard with two of my fabulous team members, Lauren Marshall, and there she is, and Becca Luberoff. I think she's still outside. A massive thanks to the Cambridge Public Library for hosting this event. The library has always been that one place in our community that is open to everyone. It's an inclusive place for immigrant families. Maria McCauley, the library director, is traveling and couldn't be with us tonight, but I wanted to say thank you, Maria. Thank you to the trustees of the library and the library staff, Muna Kangson and Zoe Delmar. I don't know if you're here, but thank you very much for all you do every day for keeping our community open and inclusive, and especially for hosting this forum tonight. And most importantly, I want to thank tonight's speakers. These passionate, committed people did not hesitate for a moment when we asked them to share their learning, their wisdom, and their experience with all of us tonight. Thank you, Susan Church, Roberto Gonzales, Daniel Kanstroom, Mojdeh Rohani, and Michael Wishnie. Thank you for your tireless efforts and for the efforts of many others like you who make it possible for us to think and to imagine the possibilities of making America truly great as a world power that values life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And now it is my pleasure to welcome Mayor Mark McGovern to the stage. His work speaks louder than any words I could use to introduce him. Thank you for being the true leader, Mark. Mark McGovern, the Mayor of Cambridge.
Thank you, Geeta. You do a great job of thanking everyone else, but I really want to give you a tremendous thank you. You know, when we first started talking about the Legal Defense Fund and thinking about it, you know, Gita was right in from the very beginning. In fact, it was something, great minds think alike, as they say, I guess. I don't know, you have a great mind. Jury's still out on mine. But, you know, this was something that I had been thinking about doing when I mentioned it to Gita, or something she was thinking about doing, and it really came together in a, you know, a very, I won't say it was easy, but a very collaborative and supportive way. And so I just really want to thank you for your leadership. Before I say a few words, I guess I have to start with a little bit of an apology in that I can't stay the whole night. So if you see me leave, please, it's not because of anything that anyone has said, but there's a potential vote happening in the Sullivan Chamber at City Hall tonight that I have to zip back for and potentially take. So I'm going to have to head out. So I just wanted to make that clear. So good evening. It's my honor to be here with all of you tonight. I want to thank the Cambridge Community Foundation, in particular Gita and Lauren, for their hard work organizing this important and timely discussion. I want to thank the Cambridge Public Library, of course, for hosting us. I want to give a special thank you and welcome to our distinguished guests, our keynote speaker, Professor Roberto Gonzales. I want to thank Anna Barros, my Deputy Chief of Staff, who I'm looking for, and thank her for all of her incredible work on this event tonight and all the events that we're having for Immigration Month this month. We're fortunate to be joined by an esteemed panel of legal experts who will each provide a unique perspective on the impact of the current immigration policies. Like many of you, I've watched in horror the stories that continue to pour in from around the country. Every day we're confronted with some new disturbing information of the reality facing thousands of migrant families and children at our southern border. Families are being brutally torn apart. Whole communities are being terrorized. We have seen images of children held in cage-like detention facilities whose conditions remain largely unknown. We have heard the sounds of children screaming for their parents, the desperation of parents who have no idea where their children are. Babies and toddlers are being held in tender age shelters. We're now hearing reports that children are being forcibly drugged and assaulted in some of these facilities. As new atrocities are uncovered, I've heard from people that this is not the America that they know, that we're better than this. As a white male, I recognize that although I feel shock and anger, my privilege means that no matter how I feel, I'm not afraid of being deported. I'm not afraid of being attacked on the street. I'm not afraid of being separated from my children. The America I know and others with my privilege know is not the America that so many in our country have experienced for hundreds of years. The fact is that the America of racism and disregard is one easily recognizable to thousands of people who are deeply and intimately familiar with the injustice and inequality perpetrated in our country. It is the America that was founded on the genocide of Native Americans and built on the backs of slaves. It is the America marred by an ugly legacy of racial discrimination and a colonialist history. What is happening right now is the natural progression of that history. The human rights violations occurring at our southern border are a disgrace and a shame to our country. They are heartless, inhumane, and deeply immoral. We have lost our moral compass. We have failed as a country. We have fallen short of our ideals. But I believe there is still time to put an end to these atrocities and to create a future that aligns with the values of liberty and equality we claim to espouse. For that to happen, we must each commit to making a difference. Inaction is not an option. Now is the time to honestly ask ourselves, both as a nation and as individuals, who do we want to be? On what side of history do we want to be remembered? Particularly for those of us in positions of influence, those of us with privilege who are allies, It is time we start making sacrifices, taking risks, thinking beyond our own comfort. It's time we start putting our bodies, our wealth, our privilege in line for justice. I look forward to these conversations and working with our community on finding concrete ways to harness the outrage we feel and put an end to this injustice and make Cambridge and our country the socially and economically just community we truly want it to be. Thank you very much for being here tonight.
Just to give you a little bit of an overview of the program, we will be joined at the podium or maybe from the table by Professor Daniel Kanstroom, who will give a little bit of an overview of what is happening. After that, Susan Church, our moderator, will moderate our fabulous panel. And Professor Roberto Gonzales, who actually just came from a 4.5-hour deposition, will join both the panel but also provide the closing remarks. So Daniel Kanstroom is the professor of law, the Thomas E. Carney Distinguished Scholar, director of the International Human Rights Program, and an associate director at the Boston College Center for Human Rights and International Justice. I am not going to read his bio in the interest of time because we want to spend most of our time in conversation with our panelists, but you have all the bios are in the program, so I encourage you to read them because we have a fabulous, very, very distinguished panel joining us. So, Daniel, thank you.
Good evening. It's truly an honor to be with you tonight to speak about these compelling and critically important topics. I especially want to thank Roberto and Lauren and my incredible co-panelists and all the other organizers who have done such a terrific job of bringing us together to talk about some of the most compelling human rights issues and, I hope and believe, one of the most compelling human rights movements of our time. I've been asked to speak briefly about where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. Obviously, these are huge topics, so what I can offer is only a sketch. But let me begin with something a bit more uplifting. I'm sure you know it, and it's well worth hearing again, especially in its full form, which has surprisingly specific resonance to our current emerging, glitteringly callous aristocracy. Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here, at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that twin cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she, with silent lips. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses, yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Now, I would like to say that this poem expresses the true historical American ideology of a nation of immigrants, but that would not be quite right, as the mayor indicated. What it expresses, I believe, is the best, most resonantly beautiful expression of an ideal. But that ideal has always been part of a deep struggle over the true nature of this country, and this is where we are today. As for specifics, it's hard to know where to begin. I try to be measured and careful in my work as I teach law and I represent clients both in the United States and after they've been deported. And a big part of that work is getting things technically right and being precise in the understanding of complex social and legal problems. But more specifically, this is where we are, in my opinion. We are in the midst of what is perhaps the most sustained, organized, cynical, fiendishly clever, racist, and brutally cruel assault on migrants, their families, their babies, for God's sake, and their communities, which includes all of us, that this country has ever seen. Even those of us who saw this coming, and I think all of us on the panel saw this coming, are shocked by the violence, the brazenness, the cruelty of what we have been witnessing in the past year and a half. I can only sketch the current scene. Millions of people have been banned from entering the United States because of their religion, or at least because of a remarkably flimsy national security assertion by a president who had openly expressed his truly biased sentiments. And perhaps worse still, the Supreme Court has now said that this is constitutionally okay. Babies have been taken from their mothers who are applying for asylum from brutal violence in Central America, and parents have been told to withdraw their asylum claims if they want to see their kids again. Long-term legal residents are being deported and permanently banished for old minor offenses. Asylum seekers are being prosecuted as criminals and facing assembly line justice. Massive detention centers for children are hidden from journalists, lawyers, and social workers. The dreamers, people who came here innocently as young children and who have succeeded to achieve the so-called American dream by any measure, live in a continuing state of uncertainty and fear. Current immigration detentions in this country are now around 50,000 people per day, and huge private businesses that detain people for deportation are profiting beyond their wildest dreams. As one investment analyst recently noted, quote, "The deportation crackdown is doing very good things for these companies," end quote. This, my fellow Americans, my fellow residents of Cambridge and of Massachusetts, my fellow human beings, this is where we are in the summer of 2018. It is a dangerous place, a bad place, a historically bad place, and it calls for deep understanding, deep compassion, but also hard, well-organized, well-focused work and true solidarity, and that's why we're here. We stand in a long Massachusetts tradition of protection of basic rights that goes back not only to the famous Tea Party, the first one, but more relevantly to sustained active resistance to the federal government's fugitive slave laws in the mid-19th century, when activists, together ultimately with lawyers and judges, prevented federal agents from arresting and transporting fugitive slaves from Boston to slave states. So how did we get here? Well, this is more complicated. The immediate cause, of course, is the banal evil of Mr. Trump, Mr. Jefferson Beauregard Sessions III, Stephen Miller, John Kelly, Kirstjen Nielsen, etc., and the Pandora's box of horribles that they have unleashed. I do think there's real racism and some true evil there, I do. But the reality is deeper and more complex than this. We are experiencing the culmination of what amounts to a long crisis over immigration in this country, and we remain in the midst of a radical multi-decade experiment with a massive, harsh deportation system that is unprecedented historically and that challenges our best moral and legal values. In many ways, the current reactionary politics and the current shameful acquiescence of our Supreme Court are manifestations of fundamental tensions that go back to the founding of the United States, and they have never been resolved. We can hear echoes today of the Alien and Sedition Act crisis that tore this country apart soon after its founding. It was, after all, Thomas Jefferson who famously wrote in 1798 that, quote, "The friendless alien has indeed been selected as the safest subject of a first experiment, but the citizen will soon follow," end quote. We hear clear echoes today of the nativist movements of the early 19th century, when rampaging crowds led by demagogues attacked Catholic churches, convents, and community centers. We see the effects of legal doctrines that arose out of the expressly racist exclusion of Chinese laborers 50 years after that, culminating in the Chinese Exclusion Act, a law about which one scholar wrote, "Its very name is an embarrassment." Our current Supreme Court passively reaffirms this idea that exclusion of non-citizens and maybe deportation too is essentially a no-rights zone where the government, and worse still, the executive branch acting on its own, need not worry very much about judicial review or any of the rights guarantees in the Constitution. As Justice Sotomayor made clear in her dissent, we hear echoes of Japanese internment when General DeWitt's order aimed at the roundup and internment of, and I quote, "all persons of Japanese ancestry, both alien and non-alien," end quote, was sustained by a Supreme Court decision that is now, belatedly and hypocritically, said by Chief Justice John Roberts to have been wrong when it was decided. Immigration scholars specifically trace the beginning of our current exclusion and deportation crisis to 1965. when major new restrictions were placed on Western Hemisphere immigration. Mexican migrants who had crossed the border relatively easily and freely for generations were suddenly required to get visas, even as U.S. employers continued to recruit them and to hire them. U.S. law and society, in short, presented a terrible mixed message. Come here to work, but you will be called illegal, and when we want to crack down and deport you, we will do so at will. Add to this the effects of generations of grinding poverty in Haiti and Central America and elsewhere, and a history of violence and oppression often supported by the United States government, and you begin to see the deeper roots of our current situation, which is also clearly a refugee and asylum crisis. A big part of the current Trump strategy is based on a system called expedited removal, a fast-track deportation system. But this is not new. In fact, 21 years ago, soon after the passage of an exceptionally harsh package of laws signed by Bill Clinton in 1996 that created expedited removal, I published a law review article that began with this sentence, quote, "If judicial review of administrative orders depriving non-citizens of the opportunity to live in the United States is an essential part of the rule of law, then 1996 may well become known as the year in which the rule of immigration law died," end quote. Creative, energetic lawyering of the type that Mike Wishnie will talk about in a couple of minutes overcame some of the judicial review preclusions about which I was most concerned then. But expedited removal created by those laws remains as an incredibly flexible, dangerous tool of enforcement power against non-citizens. You can see it now in operation all along our southern border, within 100 miles of the border, and you can experience it yourself in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, and so on. Checkpoints, quick arrests, detentions, etc., etc. Many citizens worry now about the possibility that we could soon be living in a police state. Non-citizens have essentially lived in one for more than 2 decades, and it has gotten much worse in the last 18 months. Why are these issues especially important for all of us now? There are so many reasons, but most basically, of course, are the simple moral concerns about unnecessary harms to innocent others. But it seems to me we should also focus on certain basic aspects of Trumpism as a political philosophy. To the extent that it is a coherent ideology, it embodies a resurgent nationalism of a type also now prevalent in many other parts of the world, with isolationist and revanchist impulses deeply connected to xenophobia and racism. This connects easily and fluidly to an expansion of crude, fast-track, rights-infringing systems of exclusion, detention, and deportation. Such trends fundamentally challenge the relationship between executive power and law, especially in regard to human and civil rights. The most obvious fear is that of a creeping new form of fascism, amidst a violently divisive politics and a progressive delegitimization of legal process and of rights claims. This, I think, is a fear worth having and worth paying attention to now. Deportable non-citizens, excluded Muslims, and forcibly separated families are the canaries in this coal mine. All of this, I think, brings us back to a very basic and perhaps obvious question. Are we, or are we not, a nation of immigrants? This may seem abstract to the point of banality, but I think it's crucial, and so does the Trump administration, apparently, because the immigration agency, USCIS, recently changed its mission statement, which for years had read, quote, USCIS secures America's promise as a nation of immigrants. That was their mission statement. Now it says, U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services administers the nation's lawful immigration system while protecting Americans, securing the homeland, and honoring our values. I hope the difference is as obvious to you as it was to me. So to conclude, in order to understand current legal challenges and trends, we must recognize that immigration law remains a work in progress, in which the very existence of and the boundaries of constitutional and human rights are still in many ways undetermined. We live in a time when technical legal arguments play an unusually large role in political and ideological struggles, but the deep reality is clear. We face a cynical and brutal assault on the rights of non-citizens through the harsh expansion of an exclusion and deportation system that was already oppressive by any normative, comparative, or historical measure. I believe deeply that it's my job and my responsibility to protect people as best I can from this. This is a moral imperative. but it's also a pragmatic imperative. Our task is not one of charity or protection. It's one of solidarity, progressive advancement and preservation of human and civil rights. This is the essence of what Professor Henry Hart once called the testing crucible of deportation law. He called it that in 1953. It's our task now to figure out how to pass this historic test, and I look forward to continuing to work on that with all of you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I definitely have a headache now. Yep. My name is Susan Church, and I'm introducing your panelists for the evening. I will say Professor Kanstroom is the reason I'm in the predicament I'm in with my life as an immigration lawyer. It's his fault. I curse him. Yeah, I curse him. My first job as an immigration lawyer was working in the Boston College detention clinical program, so I represented people, and it's his fault. I blame him. Anyways, thank you all for coming tonight. It's really an honor to be even near the people seated at this table. It's an incredible group of people who are big thinkers and big doers in our local community, which is particularly helpful. Professor Robert Gonzales is a professor of education at Harvard University Graduate School of Education, and the 4.5-hour deposition he just came from, which I think is in and of itself miraculous, is on the DACA case that is currently pending in the courts. And it comes from a book that he's researching that's interviewed over 500 children who were, beneficiaries of the DACA program. So it's really great work, and it's essential to our ability to continue to pursue rights for these individuals. Michael Wishnie is a clinical professor of law and counselor to the dean at Yale Law School, and although he has many claims to fame, he's probably most exciting for you is that he filed the first travel ban temporary restraining order and obtained it in the country. And it was about 7:30 at night on the Saturday after the travel ban had been instituted, and they were in court in New York. And most importantly, it was for, which I always thought was just amazing, a Iraqi interpreter who had gotten a special visa to come to the United States after serving the government. He was detained upon entering the airport in New York. Mojdeh Rohani is the director of one of the best, most thorough and all-encompassing nonprofit immigration provider. It's called Community Legal Services and Counseling Center. They have an amazing reputation because they help the whole person. There's counseling, there's everything provided to individuals, and she will bring you an incredibly unique perspective of what it's like day to day to work with these people and answer the age-old question, what can I do to help? And we all have a lot to say about that. And also, what are some of the resources and benefits that immigrants, if you know or you have those people in your lives, that they can access and how they can help? So our evening, I'm not going to talk too much more because I know you'd rather hear from the actual panelists, but we hope to give you just an overall perspective of what's happening on the ground, what are the big theological and informational issues that you need to understand in order to understand the immigration crisis that we're at, and where do we go from here. So I think we're going to start with Mojdeh Rohani from CLSACC. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you everyone for being here. Thank you to Cambridge Community Foundation for organizing this very important event. Thank you to the City of Cambridge. What an honor and how fortunate we are to be located in this wonderful city and be the recipient of your support both from the city and from Cambridge Community Foundation. An honor to be with all of you on the panel. So I am lucky enough to work with a wonderful group of immigration attorneys at our work, but I myself I'm in the mental health side of things, and so represent that side of asylum and what the clients experience and go through. So I thought of sharing with you a little bit about what an asylum seeker looks like. What do they go through? Who are these people? I think that probably we wouldn't even be having one in this room tonight because many asylum seekers would be afraid to even leave the house and go to a public event right now. So allow me to be a voice for clients who are not among us at the moment, asylum seekers. So an asylum seeker right now is a 28-year-old Honduran woman who the last thing that she remembers is plunging 25 feet down into a muddy river by her abuser, who abused her when she was first 16 years old and was raped and beaten repeatedly. And she was just, pushed down in the river basically to die. And after she survived and saved by some bystanders, had no choice but escaping and coming to this country only to be detained at our borders. And then once she was released, to be placed an ankle bracelet on her and for her movement to be monitored at all times. And she's going through the process at the moment. An asylum seeker is a mother from El Salvador with her 5-year-old, whose 14-year-old was killed by the gang. And all she had left was the 5-year-old, who she fled with and came to our borders. And then she was separated from that child. And she was put in a detention center, and the child was placed in another detention center. And we are still trying to work on that and find out how they're going to be reunited when they come out. And an asylum seeker is a person, it's not just through Central America. It could be a Ugandan woman who was raped and beaten repeatedly. And when she went to the police to complain, she was imprisoned and raped again by the police and sought refuge here, only for us to learn that maybe domestic violence and gang violence in most cases could not be the basis for asylum anymore, could not be part of social group anymore. And how do we work with those? A 16-year-old honor roll student who was deported back to Mexico and was shot and killed 2 weeks after he was deported. So these are the clients, these are the voices, and this is very real. That's what we deal with every day. And so we are left with the question of what does this mean, not just at this point in time, but for generations to come. For us as people who have a duty to be the defenders of human rights, and for those people who experience this type of trauma. It is not like that the trauma just happens at the border when they come. The trauma, the separation is just the last thing in the whole line of traumatic events that these individuals go through. And once you eventually get to them as a provider, how do you start? Where do you begin to process this complicated, multiple levels of trauma that the person has experienced, sometimes for their entire lifetime, and trying to come to this country in the hope of having some safety, some security, and not only to be experiencing what we are seeing in our borders. So we are trying to fight gangs. How are we doing that? By treating these children in the worst possible way that we can? Guess what? We are harboring the next generation of gangs. Because to whom are they going to have loyalty? To the people who separated them from their parents and put them in detention? To learn just recently that one thing that has been practiced, particularly as a mental health practitioner, I find that very disturbing. These children are being placed under the care of Office for Refugee Resettlement, is a federal branch of the government under Health and Human Services. And once they are taken into detention centers, separated from their parents, they have social workers and psychologists who go and meet with them and prepare reports. And of course, when a child has a parent or a guardian, then you check with the parent or the guardian, and the information is confidential, and you will not share that with anyone. But in the absence of guardians and parents, the information that has been gathered from a very traumatized child or teenager is being shared with Homeland Security, and it's being used to transfer these children, youth, either to higher security, prison-like detention centers, or to deport them. We live in a time when the parents who are in detention are asked to sign their deportation documents in order to be reunited with their children. If this is not coercion, what is this? What is going to be our place in history? As people that just stood by and let this happen, or as people who did something about that? And doing something about this, I know that we are all moved to do something and to take steps and to be proactive. And that is so wonderful. Especially Cambridge is a place we are lucky to be in, this wonderful city. And I can say as an agency that has a large number of volunteers, currently we have 140 volunteers, both on the legal and mental health side, providing invaluable services to our clients. But I want to emphasize that at the time, this time being, the best thing that you can do is to support the work of these organizations by your financial contributions. And why do I say that? Why maybe not volunteering at this moment in time? Because these cases are extremely complicated. And the amount of time that is going to take for an immigration attorney to train a volunteer, or for a mental health worker to train on forensic psychological evaluations and testimony on behalf of these individuals, is going to be extremely time consuming. We are working here on site, and also we are all, trying to organize and travel to our southern borders. So it's between our southern borders, and we have on staff trained attorneys who are senior, who know how to do this work, and there will be a time that they can train more volunteers to do this work. But right now, we help your financial support. We want you to enable us to do the work that we are trained to do and allow us to be a voice for a population that really does not have a voice at the moment, for people who we need to call to let them know that, no, today, ICE is not at Maverick Station. Today, you can come in for your appointments. And if there is a raid, we try to put them on Uber to come and see us. If you check with Cambridge Health Alliance here, they will tell you that the no-show rates of immigrant clients have gone up significantly because they're afraid to go to their medical appointments. They're afraid to apply for any kind of benefits. And while maybe a year ago we could reassure them that, no, this is not going to interfere with your immigration status in any way if you apply for health benefits or something, it's not the kind of reassurance we can even give anymore, because we don't even know how things are going to change in a day to come, in the week to come, in the months to come. And so it is upon us to do the best that we can and use the training that we have to assist this population. The need is overwhelming. So we need your assistance in this way. And so please give the support that you can, and let us together be a voice. Yesterday I had a conversation with a colleague in another state that was asking, I do some international work related to asylum and human rights in East Africa, a number of countries there, and we were talking about the crisis here at home, and also there has been an ongoing situation in Cameroon, Congo, and Mali also this week. Really, civil war is breaking in those countries, and I was talking about some of my work with some organizations there, and he asked me, but what is your problem? Why are you worrying about everyone everywhere? And I said, human rights is not about geographical distance. It's about our shared humanity. So it's not about southern borders, it's not about Congo, it's not about it's about what our place is at any point in time and what is going to be our legacy when the generations to come after us look back at this shameful time. What did we do to change that? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much to the organizers, Lauren and Gita and everybody, for including me here. The original plan was that Roberto was going to kick us off, and I'm not sure in a happy way necessarily. Then we were going to go through Dan and eventually to me to project forward and talk about what is to be done so that we might think a little bit about what concrete steps we might be able to do. We're going to let you recover from your deposition. So you're as good as it gets is going to be now, I'm afraid, and then we're going to go dark again. But I was asked to say a few words about what is to be done. And it's, I think it's a deeply important question, even as horrible as the last few days, weeks, months have been. For people laboring in the field of immigration and immigration services, to go through a week where family separation left me with a pit in my stomach that I had not experienced for I don't know how long, and then to have the Muslim ban be affirmed, and to be so upset that Justice Kennedy was the fifth vote to affirm it. And now I'm even more upset that he won't be the fifth vote, that we're only going to get somebody worse. And DACA is hanging by its fingernails, and maybe Roberto will say more about that. But still, coming together is helpful. I think for people in the field who are so caught up in the trauma that you just heard spoken about so eloquently, it's important to move beyond those stories and to take something from the courage and the resiliency of our clients and the members of immigrant communities and households in Cambridge and in Massachusetts and across the country who are under so much extraordinary stress right now, and yet still find a way to get their kids dressed in the morning and off to school, to work, to put food on the table, and to keep carrying on. And if they can, if people under so much stress in households like that you just heard about can carry on, I think we have to as well. So let me say a few things at a very general level and then get much more concrete. So what is to be done? Absolutely. The first thing I wrote down is give money. So whatever your level of giving was, it should be a little bit more. Whatever our capacity is, I think all of us have to try to do a little bit more and to support the organizations that are full-time engaged in trying to support and protect families and households in Cambridge and beyond. I think all of us have to give voice. However many protests you used to go to in a month or a year, we all have to show up at one more. We have to be out and join our voices to the voices of others. And again, whatever your baseline comfort level is, I think this is a time where we all have to show up a little bit more. And we have to bear witness. And sometimes that means going down to the border where we don't live and can't be every day, or being at an ICE pickup or check-in or a courtroom. We have to just stand and bear witness to the human experience before us. I think we also have to work very hard to elect people who better reflect our values. And that might feel like in Cambridge, well, we can't do better than what we've got. How can we do that? But Maine isn't that far away. And there are elections in Maine that matter for governor and one of the House seats. There are elections everywhere that matter. There's elections in Connecticut that matter. So again, whatever our baseline engagement with electoral politics are, I think there's actually no substitute for doing a little bit more. We cannot simply sit back and figure other people will knock on doors, other people will give to campaigns, however distasteful or uncomfortable that feels. I think there's no substitute for the retail engagement, one-to-one. One of the lessons I've taken from friends who have been in the LGBT rights movement for many years was that marriage equality didn't come from some Supreme Court on high announcing it. Actually, it didn't come from Justice Kennedy. It came from the under-the-radar, nitty-gritty work of conversations, one-on-one, people talking to their family, to their neighbors, to their co-workers, to people that they worship with. And it was only when the public had turned in favor of marriage equality, that the courts followed. Because one of the lessons that any law professor will teach you is that the courts don't lead, they follow. They know where the sentiment in the country is and they follow. And so there's no substitute for having those conversations in campaigns and in communities right now. I think we have to do all of that. So I'm going to shift now to some specific things that are a little more specific to immigration and that are things that even here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think we could attend to. I want to preface this by saying that I still think back, it's not nearly as profound as what Professor Kanstroom gave you, but on 9/11, when my wife, who's here, and I were living in Brooklyn, and our kids were very little, and I came home from school with them the day that the planes hit the buildings, and this was before iPhones and the internets and stuff like that. And I was so fearful about what to say to my kids and how to talk to them and how to shield them from the images, and I was so overwhelmed with what was happening in the country. And I actually saw a clip of Mr. Rogers, like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it was an old clip, and he said, he was talking about how to talk to children about trauma, but I was taking it in. And he said, if children see a burning building, they see it on TV, there's some fire, and they're frightened, and people are in danger, and they might perish. He said, show the children that at the edges of the screen, there are always people trying to help. At the edges of the great catastrophe, there's an ambulance or a firefighter or someone trying to help. And they can't always save everybody, let's be real, but there's always people trying to help. Try to be the helper and try to focus on the helpers as well as the conflagration in front of us that we can't always put out before harm is done. So I think I think there's help that we can render, even if we can't stop everything right now. Okay, so now I'm going to just kind of tick off a bunch of things, and I'm glad to talk in the Q&A about all the lawsuits and the cases, many of which my students and I and colleagues are involved in on DACA and on the travel ban and everything. But I'm not going to focus on that now. So here in Cambridge, everyone in this room can help to defend families one by one. They can support the Legal Defense Fund and make sure that they have competent counsel. They can show up for hearings and sit in courtrooms and go to ICE for check-ins. They can join Not One More campaigns, which are mobilized when one person is under immediate threat of removal. The local sanctuary policies, the welcoming policies of the city of Cambridge are strong, and they can always be stronger. And the effort to build a legal defense fund is part of that. But continuing to ensure that the police department here is separated from ICE, not just in day-to-day practices, but in databases and delinking databases and information sharing. In Massachusetts, the courthouses are mostly state. I don't even know if there's a municipal function here, but the city of Cambridge can make clear that it doesn't want its residents risking arrest and deportation by going into state courthouses, which is a current fight at the state level I'll get to. Municipal ID programs have been adopted by many cities to try to better integrate people, and I know that Cambridge has strong school policies to try to ensure that parents feel safe bringing their kids to school and knowing that there won't be cooperation with ICE. At the state level in Massachusetts, there's a huge battle right now about ICE presence in state courthouses, and the judicial branch has not yet stood up. I'll be candid. They're being asked to stand up and protect the integrity of state courthouses from ICE predations, but they haven't done it yet. And apart from lawsuits which are pending, or legal proceedings are pending, the state courts on their own could adopt rules to ensure that ICE agents don't enter the courthouses and try to pick off people who are coming to appear for their cases. The state should better de-link its databases at the DMV from ICE. It's under an agreement right now that provides a lot of records to ICE through the FBI. It could renegotiate. It could seek to renegotiate its agreement with the FBI to better protect Massachusetts residents. The Port Authority, which runs Logan, controls the physical space at Logan. It could insist that people who are arriving and haven't yet gone through CBP or TSA checks have access to counsel. There could be legal counsel physically in Logan Airport behind customs lines, not interfering with customs, not preventing customs from doing their work, but giving counsel to people caught up in various airport traps that are being run right now. The Massachusetts National Guard, I believe, allows its training facilities to be used by ICE for training. That's certainly true in Connecticut, where I live most of the time. There's no requirement that Massachusetts make its facilities available for ICE training. They could say, we're not going, as long as you behave the way you do, we're not going to let you use our facilities for your training. Massachusetts could make driver's licenses available without regard to immigration status, as we've done in Connecticut and a number of other states have done. Massachusetts can make state financial aid more available for residents who are going to college, not just in-state tuition, but state financial aid. Massachusetts could and should adopt a law that 4 other states have done that lowers the maximum penalty for misdemeanor convictions in the state from 365 days to 364 days. Take 1 day off the maximum sentence, and a whole class of residents will be shielded from deportation because conviction for misdemeanors will no longer subject them to automatic deportation. California, Washington, Nevada, and Oregon have done that. Connecticut's getting close. This is to say there are many things that the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has not yet done, but should. And in addition to service organizations, there are activist organizations pressing those issues at the state legislature, and you have the capacity to join your voices to theirs and make Massachusetts separate itself from the secret police that Dan talked about, who are taking advantage of the networks and community institutions and state facilities that we have made available to them. I'll end with just a word on the lawyers. I was asked to say something about the lawyers. So lawyers are not going to save us, newsflash, right? Neither are the judges, as we've seen all too clearly. Lawyers have a role to play because so many of the immigration proceedings are legal proceedings. So lawyers have a role to play, but they won't save us. Good lawyering can buy time, both at the macro level, and so the lawsuits against the travel ban and the Muslim and refugee ban postponed the reckoning for 1.5 years, from January 17 to June of 18. So for 1.5 years we staved it off. That's it. There will be as-applied challenges to follow. There will be some skirmishing still to come, but we basically bought 1.5 years, and now that's done. DACA, we've kept open since it was supposed to close, a matter of months. I don't know that it's going to stay open much longer, despite the enormous efforts of Roberto and many, many other people. The path through the courts, it could close as early as the early fall, I think. So DACA could be gone as early as the early fall, or we could get it past the midterms and maybe the House turns and maybe that opens up legislative positions. But individual lawyers can bring as-applied challenges, and they can try to match the creativity and the courage of our clients by doing things that immigration lawyers don't always like to do, like motions to suppress, federal habeas petitions, and federal civil rights actions under the Federal Tort Claims Act and Bivens and Section 1983. And they can behave in ways that are not comfortable, that take them out of their just familiar zones, that require them to battle with judges in the way public defenders are used to doing. But the immigration bar, in my experience, not specific to Cambridge, but generally, has long had an approach that's a little bit more accommodating, thinking that their best path forward was to kind of go along and get along in too many cases. But it's time for battle. Our clients' needs require that. And there's always room for creativity, and I'll end on that note. There's the things that no one has thought of before, the ideas that my students, that our clients, that our communities generate that at first seem perplexing and wrong, and then the more you think about it, you say, well, it actually hasn't been tried. I can't say for sure it won't work. This is a time to embrace those creative, risk-taking strategies. And I know I'm a silver linings guy, and I'm a happy warrior. I filed 3 briefs yesterday. We're filing a new lawsuit tomorrow. I haven't given up on all this stuff. But sometimes those things work. And as terrible as the Supreme Court has gotten, in my experience, lower court judges are getting better. After years of litigating before technocratic, I don't want to insult anyone in the room, but technocratic, cautious, moderate appointees by President Clinton and President Obama, who heard you out and said, no, I don't know, I just can't see it, they're a little bit unleashed too. It's not just the ICE agents. And the judges at the lower levels are starting to embrace ideas and values and act on them in ways that they haven't. And we fail our clients if we don't ask them to take those big steps that a year ago they wouldn't take. Supreme Court turning is terrible. Supreme Court decides 80 cases a year. The lower courts decide hundreds of thousands of cases a year. And those lower court judges are going to have the space, and if we call upon them, they will find a way to buy us a little bit more time and a little bit more time, and eventually we'll get through this. Thank you.
Okay, so where do people ask questions? Just stand up in the back of the room. So now we're going to open it up for questions. I did want to say one thing about lawyering, and I do believe that you are right, that the immigration bar was pretty quiet back in the day, and I would say they are on fire now, on fire. Like, they are so angry and so mad. And in Boston, we've been training lawyers to go into federal court because our Boston lawyers, immigration lawyers, never went to federal court. There's about 5 of us that ever went in, and we have a program set up to try to fund federal litigation. And Massachusetts has a new rule that the government's backing down on, but that you can't arrest people at immigration interviews. Our Judge Wolf is about to sign a class action certification, we think, to prevent them from arresting people at immigration interviews. We have a brand new case that says that the government actually should bear the burden of proof in a deportation detainment case rather than the immigrant, which is what it used to be before. If you think about that's insane, right? You have to prove your own liberty is worthwhile. And Judge Saris has ruled that I don't want to go into the ruling, but it's an amazing decision. And before she issued the decision, she said something to the equivalent of, like, I'm not going to be the one that turns around the boat, meaning the boat that was bringing Jewish people to our shores during the Holocaust. And that was the quote in the Boston Globe. So our federal bench is on fire, and our immigration lawyers are on fire. They're tired, they're exhausted. And there's way too few of them because we never litigated before like we used to. So people ready to ask questions now? Okay. Just go. Do you want them to stand up? Okay, there you go.
Sure. My name is Ali Malihi. I'm actually originally from Iran. I live in Cambridge. My question is, why are you raising so little money?
That's a very, very good way to start off the questions. That we need to raise more. I mean, look, that brings up a good question. Does anyone want to take that?
I really don't have an answer why, but I think that it could be, some of it could be just contribution fatigue, because a while back when it started, the crisis started, a lot of people gave. And that's the problem. When we have a crisis, a lot of organizations, individuals are moved to give in the beginning, but not realizing that we need to continue the support. Otherwise, you are just you're supporting a program, maybe, let's say, one attorney position for a year. Then what? That attorney is going to take on so many cases, so many clients. What's going to happen after that? So it needs to be ongoing, and we need to realize that this was not just a crisis that came about a year ago, and now it's ending, it's getting worse. So I think it's a matter of raising awareness and just doing events such as what you have been doing.
Well, I would say, I'm not even sure, I love the question in the sense that it will inspire people to do more, but I'm not sure it's true, because I think particularly with the recent family separation, which I think was a shock to the system for many people. I mean, I've been talking about these issues for 25 years, and, you know, every once in a while people notice something and then they get fired up. But this was the worst thing that a lot of people had ever seen, and there have been millions and millions and millions of dollars going down to organizations in Texas and Arizona at the border. So I think the response is starting. I think it may be harder at the local level because the sense right now is that the crisis is particularly there, and maybe what we need to do is raise more consciousness about how the crisis is here too, and those kids in fact are coming here, but even beyond that, the bigger crisis is here.
Geeta?
I'm just going to take a moment to respond to that question, because that was actually a question that we asked ourselves. We put out a call for 500,000, we've only raised 150,000. And I think there are a couple of reasons. One is that people don't think that there is a crisis in Cambridge. And actually, the more we look into the data, the more we find out it's a hidden crisis, but there is a crisis in Cambridge. A third of our families are immigrant families. We have that problem in our high school. We have the problem in our universities. We have the problem in workplaces. I think another reason is that people feel a sense of helplessness about this. What can I do? But I think, as you've heard from the panel, every dollar we raise can help a family do something. You know, we can help. We can definitely help, and money is really the core right now, which is why we are restricting the use of this money for legal defense. We are not doing it for education. We are not doing it for other costs, volunteering and all of that. We are directing money towards legal defense because that is the highest need right now. And I think a third reason has been that people have felt that they did not want to take a partisan issue. The city cannot invest in this because they may lose federal funding. Universities won't invest in this because they may lose, science and technology federal funding, the grants that they get. Businesses are not willing to invest in this because they're afraid that they will have some roadblocks. So this atmosphere of fear that this has created is so palpable that it is putting a block, and I think we have to get beyond that. We have to raise our voice beyond that. So definitely the need is there. Pass this message along to whoever you speak to because it is a really important issue right now.
In the vest there? Oh, there. Okay, sorry, go ahead. Go ahead. Okay, I didn't realize.
Two things. One, an announcement in terms of something people can do. There are national protests being organized for June 30th, and there's an event, Boston City Plaza, at 11 o'clock this coming Saturday, so people should try to get out to that. This is somewhat of a political question. There's a race going on in Cambridge, that Cambridge is part of a legislative congressional district, and one of the candidates has called for abolishing ICE. A primary winner who won in New York and defeated an incumbent, part of her program was to get rid of ICE. Could you, as people who are very involved in this field, explain that to some of us? Why there are calls for? Would it make any difference? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
ICE was created in 2002 and 3, but before that, it was the INS, which many of you are more familiar with as the deportation agency. ICE has developed a reputation, which I think is well earned, for a certain casual cruelty and expeditiousness. There's another agency, which, since I was talking about expedited removal, it's Customs and Border Protection, which is actually even worse than ICE. I mean, less protections, less formality. So I think if history is any guide, I mean, INS was actually originally the brainchild or developed out of work that was done by J. Edgar Hoover in deporting anarchists from New York, and Emma Goldman, among others, in 1920. So there's a long history of deportation. So I'm not sure how you get at that by eliminating one particular agency. I think the bigger question is, why are we deporting so many people? And for a lot of these people, I've been asking this question for years, particularly about lawful permanent residents or long-term residents who are being deported for very minor offenses. I think it's really hard to come up with a good answer to that question because these people serve their time in the criminal justice system, they get whatever punishment there is, and then they get deported. And now we're seeing at the border similar kinds of questions. And why do we have a policy like this? But I'm not sure that eliminating ICE would accomplish that much unless you also eliminate Customs and Border Protection. And I mean, they're now in Homeland Security. Before that, they were in the Department of Justice. In my experience, and I litigated against the INS for many years when they were in the Department of Justice, it wasn't much better. So, I'm not sure that I mean, Mike may differ from me on this. He seems ready to.
Well, there are a bunch of hands up, so I don't want to dwell
more than I do.
too much on this. But yes, we should abolish ICE.
Yeah,
it's a secret
that's my
police
answer
force.
too.
We
Yes,
should abolish ICE.
they're evil. But Customs and Border Protection is the organization that said to my mother, who has a 8-year-old daughter taken away from her, who I filed a lawsuit today on behalf of, as they took the daughter away, they said, "Do you celebrate Mother's Day in Guatemala?" And the woman said yes, and the CBP officer who was taking her daughter said, "Happy Mother's Day." So I vote for both to be gone. So.
Well, you should eliminate Corey Lewandowski, too. I don't mean eliminate, I mean abolish. careful what you say on TV.
Speaking of thinking globally and acting locally, the New York Times published a list of states that were receiving children from the border, and Massachusetts was on that list. Does anyone know whether that's true, and if so, where those children are, and whether there's anything that we could do about, to address that issue?
So we actually have Marissa Howe. This is a special treat for everybody. Yes, it is. Marissa Howe is the Director of Kids in Needs of Defense in Massachusetts, and they represent unaccompanied minors, and she would like to address those issues.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of talk on it. I think there's been a lot of circular talk on it. I hear this, I hear that. There's some rumors. As far as we know, the children who are still being detained, so a child can be released, right, to a caretaker and still be in deportation proceedings. But the children that you're referring to are still being detained. It might be in a shelter detention or what have you. They're not physically in Massachusetts right now. Their parents might be, and Susan can talk about that. But those children are not. The typical time that a child spends who's been separated and deemed unaccompanied from their parent is about 60 days. So most of the children that would have been impacted by this policy back instituted at the beginning of May or so are still within those 60 days. So my answer could change in a month. But right now, those children are not physically present in Massachusetts. We do have a long-term foster care provider in Worcester called Accentria, and they would receive long-term foster care children, but those children are typically children who have been in shelter for 6 to 8 months and literally have no one. They haven't been reunited with a parent, don't have a caretaker here in the United States. So there is a lot of talk about children arriving in Massachusetts, but right now, they're not physically here. But ask me again in a month.
Now, I think what you will see is parents released who come here to reunite with other family, then try to get their child here, and that's what my client is doing, and the government's just being cruel. I don't even know how to, they want her fingerprints taken. They already took her prints. They want an investigation for household. It's just another demonesque behavior by the government. So
I would just caveat to say that I don't have any specific information that's different than that, but I don't actually think the federal government really knows where everybody is.
Oh, yeah.
I do agree with that.
Yeah.
And so we have identified at least 2 kids in Connecticut, probably 3, who were separated at the border, and the kids are in Connecticut. And we know that there's some couple hundred in New York. So I would be surprised if at the end of the day it didn't turn out, that there had been a small number in Massachusetts. Because I spoke with people in the Massachusetts Attorney General's office just before they joined the case in Washington State that they filed, and they were still trying to determine whether there are kids in Massachusetts, and they were not ready to say there are none. There might well be none, so I don't have anything specific.
Yeah, no, I think you're right.
It's chaotic.
The number in New York is actually upwards of 350 children that have been transferred to shelter in that state. And I think that separation of children from their parents is not something that was created in May. That happened beforehand. We have clients that we represent currently through either staff at our organization or through pro bono attorneys that were separated from their parents a year ago, 2 years ago. So it is a zero tolerance policy that has gotten the press right now, but it's not a new policy either.
So this is actually an excellent point, and this is a narrative that drives me crazy in the press. The ACLU lawsuit that was just, they won last night, that was filed on February 28th. An organization filed an affidavit in that case in March saying their small nonprofit alone had identified 492 children separated from their parents at the border in March, way before zero tolerance, way before, General Kelly's deterrence comments. And if that's the number, and you think there are anywhere between 60 and 80,000 apprehensions by CBP a year, we are looking at way more than 2,300 children, and I do not believe that number at all. Not to make the rank worse. Okay, next.
A couple hands over here.
Hi, so this might be a little long, so I'm sorry. So my name is Jalile Garcia, and I'm originally from Honduras. So the question I might ask might veer away kind of from immigration, but more perhaps like human rights / international policy. So is there a way that we can support maybe like internationally or like international efforts to stabilize these areas, particularly like the Northern Triangle, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador? In Honduras, I know particularly gang violence kind of thrives due to political instability, poverty, a plethora of reasons, and the U.S. kind of also helps to embolden these, whether it be governments, and yeah. So how can we address this internationally? Is there a way to address this internationally? Because one of the things that I've thought about a lot as like a Honduran, I'm a dual citizen, but as a Honduran national, specifically having been born and raised there, is what can I do so that people in my country aren't fleeing? And it's a problem. Like gang violence is definitely a problem, but how can we make it so that people don't, does that make sense?
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, let me speak to this a little bit, because I've been researching this question in other places around the world, and particularly in Europe. There's a much more well-developed history of trying to use development-based solutions to stop the migration flow. And I think it is a very logical, in some ways compelling way to think about the problem. It makes perfect sense. If we could equalize the massive poverty, if we could get a hold on the violence and the oppression in those regimes, that would, of course, be an important thing to do. I'm a little jaded about this based on the experience that they've had in Europe, which is that these sorts of programs have very limited success, and they tend to blunt the force of the sort of arguments we're making about the importance of maintaining the human rights claims of the people who get here. So I think you have to be really careful how you calibrate your thinking about development solutions. There's a lot of money now from the World Bank through the UN trying to develop a sort of orderly, controlled idea of migration. But what it's led to is a system like in the UK, for example, of money to people to voluntarily return to their countries, and then they get set up in some sort of small business, and then if they try to get back, it's even more difficult than it was before. So I think you have to look really carefully at these programs. I do agree in theory it could work, but I think it has to be paired with a strong fight for the rights of refugees and people fleeing forced migrants in general, because otherwise it tends to lead to a loss of energy on behalf of the migrants and the refugees themselves.
Anyone else on that question? Next.
Hi, I have a question. Oh, sorry, did you?
Well, you can go first, and then we'll make sure.
Yeah, so this question is about last night's order out of the Southern District of California. I wanted to know specifically what this would mean for whatever portion of the maybe up to 700 families had parents who are maybe currently subject to criminal proceedings. Because it seemed like if they're in immigration custody, they had to reunite the children, we have the timelines, but not when they're in criminal proceedings or criminal custody. So what does this mean for whatever portion of these families who have separated children, already separated pre-executive order, but were subject to criminal proceedings?
The government may have a different view of this, of course, but I don't think it matters whether the parents are in criminal proceedings or immigration proceedings. They can be detained during the pendency of their criminal proceedings in various facilities. In fact, many people are held by CBP, the agency that Dan was just talking about, even while they go through their very rapid criminal proceedings and get sentenced to time served for 3 days. They actually sometimes never even really leave CBP physical space. Their legal custody might shift from Bureau of Prisons or U.S. Marshals or something like that, but they can stay in facilities. The mechanics of working out how different kids will be reunited with different parents within the 30 days set by the court, or 14 days for the younger children, may involve some case-by-case things depending where the kid is, where the parent is, what the posture is. But there's no blanket exception for parents who are in criminal proceedings. Again, the government may have a different view, they may take appeals and so forth, but as it stands, it's just across-the-board order. Get the kids back together with the parents in 30 days.
Hello, my name is Felipe. I'm originally from El Salvador, so I echo what our friends said from Honduras. I came to this country in the 80s, fleeing the civil war in El Salvador, and luckily I'm a citizen now, so I can vote. And I'm very worried about the people that are under temporary protected status, whose kids are also will be separated starting in July. I wonder where we are with that, and whether or not you guys have any information on that. Because, I mean, we are seeing the separation of kids in the borders right now, but we also will see that separation of parents and kids when TPS ends and people are forced to go back. And I appreciate all of you to be here today to learn more about what you can do. But, you know, one thing that I would recommend, I know that many immigrants feel afraid to come to these kind of events, but I think that hearing from them, hearing their stories, is also a good way to motivate people to give more money.
I mean, there are quite a number of lawsuits that have been filed to try to prevent the termination of TPS for nationals of many countries. I know the ACLU of Southern California case was argued on Friday. Other cases are in different places. Broadly speaking, I would say it's difficult, and consistent with what I said earlier, I think that the courts at most may buy some time, but I think they're unlikely to indefinitely hold open TPS when the president has tried to terminate it. So I think if the court cases are successful, I suspect they will only buy some time, and it will only be through political solution that there can be justice done, and that will require, I think, winning some elections in this fall and in 2 years.
I agree with that, but I want to say something a little stronger than that, and I want to be careful how I say it, but your question raised a thought in my mind, which is, if people are afraid to come to public forums like this in the city of Cambridge, then we need to find ways to protect them and to make them feel that if ICE agents were to come into this room, we would do what we could to prevent them from arresting those people. And this is a very delicate thing, and as a lawyer, you know, I have to be really careful about saying these kinds of things, but it is something that needs to be thought through. And you think back of the history of the Fugitive Slave Act resistance in Boston and in Massachusetts. It wasn't all litigation, you know. I mean,
The judges went along. The judges sent the fugitive slaves back.
well, some of them did, and then but there was also civil disobedience. And I was reading an article the other day about CBP stops on I-93 in Maine in the Times, and there's a bit of a question in the article: what happens if you're a U.S. citizen and you're driving down the highway and they say, are you a citizen or not? It's sort of an untested question. What happens if you say, I'm, with all due respect, I don't think I have to answer that question to you, a government agent in this country. Now, what would happen if you said that? Well, you'd be pulled over for secondary inspection. You might sit for half an hour. You might sit for 7 hours. Who knows? They might come up with some charge criminally, to charge you with something. I don't think they could. I don't think CBP has the jurisdiction if you are, in fact, a U.S. citizen. I'm just saying that creative activist lawyers should be, this goes back to thinking outside the box of what kinds of civil disobedience or civil resistance might begin to be necessary in this situation. I was not at that point in my career, but I'm getting there now. I'm getting there where I'm willing to talk, at least think and talk about it.
And maybe while they're CBP is dealing with you, a truckload of undocumented immigrants will drive by and they'll be saved because you were taking up CBP's time. So.
But don't take this as legal advice. You have to be really careful how you do things like this.
Who has the mic?
Okay. Hi. I'm a graduate student at Boston College School of Social Work, and I have a question in terms of how social workers can help with what's going on. I think that there obviously is a good opportunity to be addressing some of the trauma that was spoken about so eloquently, and I'm just wondering how new or experienced social workers could kind of partner with the legal aspect to kind of provide those services and what that's looking like.
I think Mojdeh is going to take that.
I think the great thing about social work is that we can really be activists and do a lot with policy matters, and there are so many petitions going on at the moment, so you can definitely make calls, sign those letters, or just encourage your educational institutions to go behind such things such as the Safe Communities Act, such as lifting the cap on kids and other things that are going on. Join other institutions, larger one, Human Rights First, Amnesty, those that are there, and be active in that way. And you may also find opportunities to volunteer if you want to do clinical work. I wouldn't say right now doing forensic psychological evaluation and testimony, because as students they are going to immediately disqualify you. It will be very hard to get qualified as an expert right now. We have had a lot of difficulty with that, so it may be some ongoing treatment and then doing some policy and advocacy work.
But if I may speak on behalf of my employer, Boston College has been really at the forefront of thinking this through, and the deans of the School of Social Work and School of Law have put together a faculty committee, of which I'm a part, through the Provost's office, to organize a conference to think more systematically about how social workers and lawyers can work together on these kinds of things. So stay tuned and you'll hear about it.
And can I just add to that really quick? We have a social services coordinator at Kind in most of our offices, all but one actually. And one of the hardest things we have in front of us serving traumatized children is to come up with pro bono mental health, not forensic psychological evaluations, but literally mental health. And so any programs that we can start developing and thinking creatively about providing Spanish-speaking pro bono long-term mental health services would be an amazing thing for these children. So just a plug, to think creatively.
Okay, maybe one or two more questions left.
Hi, I wanted to expand on the question about TPS, but more specifically about civil disobedience. Not only is immigration at the forefront of our political thing, but also there are a lot of concerns about racism and xenophobia. And in the context of civil disobedience, I think it's challenging for people of color to be at the forefront of that, and I kind of wanted to broach that subject and see how we can, or I myself as a white citizen, can be both an ally but also recognize the challenges that other citizens will face not being white citizens.
Who wants to take that? Roberto?
Dan doesn't want to give the legal advice, but I'll offer some political advice. Yes. Yes to the premise of your question. Those who risk the least need to step forward now. And again, each of us is in our own place, and we have the baselines we start from, and some people are already further along a certain pathway, and for them this is a natural next step. For other people, this is a frightening and concerning thing that they might get to eventually. But in my own counseling of people considering committing disobedience, I try to counsel one by one if I can. And the exposure for someone who isn't a citizen, the exposure for someone who is a citizen but isn't white, the exposure for someone who is a citizen and is white, it varies for the reasons you say. And people have to make their individual decisions, of course, always in light of the facts and circumstances of their life, about whether they'll take that chance. But it seems to me that those of us who can do this most safely have a greater obligation to step forward.
Okay, we're taking one last question at this time. Who's the lucky last question? I'll let the microphone people make that difficult decision.
Hi, my name is Stan Lawrence. I formerly ran Revolution Books in Harvard Square for several years, currently working with the Bob Avakian Institute. There seems to be a duality here of the specific legal questions, but then the morality underlying a lot of the work that you all do and have committed yourself to. And Professor Kanstroom spoke to it some too. It seems to me that we're facing almost an existential crisis in this country and around the world. We have concentration camps being built for tens of thousands of people to be incarcerated. The recent article in Slate magazine by, I think, Michael Slate, tracing the history of concentration camps in Germany in the early 30s when they were first being set up and how they were rationalized at the time. So I think this thing about thinking outside the box is a critical question that people are raising here today, because I don't think we can stay where we're at. Even the work that you're doing is like so important, yet at the same time it's like putting the shutters up on a beachfront apartment facing a tsunami coming in on us. So I don't know if people can speak to that specifically, but I do also want to add that I do think that at times like these, thinking outside the box means what has been the history of the United States? What has led to this point, you know, in our history, and the possibilities that we might actually need to radically rupture with a lot of the ideas about democracy and the good of this country in order to come about with an actual, you know, moral decision, you know, and going forward. And that's where I would really encourage people to check out the work of Bob Avakian in particular, who's a revolutionary communist who has developed a whole new liberatory vision of the possibilities of a new future. So people can speak to that question of morality if they want, they already have, but I do think that the questions here are really very profound, and I really appreciate the opportunity that you provided here tonight.
There was a lot in there. I don't want to respond to all of it. But I do want to say that one of the things that we've been kind of tacking back and forth between is the utter profound value of saving one life. And the universe that is saved when one life is saved. And it's not, to me, shutters on the Titanic and a tsunami or whatever. It's saving one person and then saving the next person and then the next person. And we're also talking about the ways that collectively we can try to intervene structurally, because we know there'll never be enough of us for every one person. And that there'll be people who just won't be reached because they don't live in Cambridge or whatever. So I do think we have to do both. And we have to value it, and we have to understand the worth of that work. And I said at the beginning, lawyers won't save us. I think social workers might save us, seriously, because I think they might help to heal us and to repair us when we have come through this. And by us, I mean, of course, first and most of all, the most directly affected communities, to your point, but also those of us who are trying to engage and trying to be helpful and try to follow the leadership of those communities that are most in the crosshairs right now, and make the choices or support the choices they are making in the ways that they are making them. So I did want to say on that point, I spend a lot of my time filing big fancy lawsuits against the travel ban and to save DACA and so forth, and I also spend a lot of time, and it's the part that doesn't get in the newspapers, trying to save one person, and then one more person, and then one more person too.
I think that I'm not sure how to put this exactly. I guess I should say that I think the sort of Marxist critique of the current moment is useful, but it hasn't led me yet to the thought that we're at that point yet. I mean, I think Trump doesn't come as a wolf in sheep's clothing. The wolf is coming as a wolf. We see the wolf. The wolf is at the door. But I still think that I still have some faith in the possibilities of the legal system if it's energized and deployed properly, and as Mike was saying, social work and community activism and civil disobedience. I still think that this particular threat can be deflected and delayed and fought, and I think we can I still have some hope that we can avoid the worst possible outcomes here if we maintain a tactically sharp sense of how to fight it and keep our energy up to fight it. That's my analysis to that.
It also helps not to read the Supreme Court decision on the travel ban so you can live in denial about the actual decision, which is what I did. Okay, now I think we're going to go on to our last panelist, Roberto Gonzales, to hopefully...
So I realize that it's we're nearing the 8 o'clock hour, so I will try to be short in my remarks. I want to thank Gita, thank Lauren for putting this together, for your incredible work. Thank you to the Cambridge Community Foundation. More generally, thank you to the Cambridge Public Library. Mike mentioned a reshuffling of our order because of my deposition. And so I want to give a slightly different talk than I was going to give, and I want to kind of focus in on the local level. I got into this work 26 years ago. I've been doing research for the last 16 years. I've been an academic for the last 16 years. But 10 years prior to that, I worked as a youth worker in Chicago. I started early 90s out of college. I lived and worked in the same Chicago community. I lived a half a block from my first job, a community center, that I moved 4 blocks away. to head up a large youth program. I directed a large youth program. And so I've had the opportunity to think about, to make connections in my life between research, policy, and practice. Certainly, we've been bombarded by images and sounds over the last few days. And more than that, terrible policy after terrible policy, from the travel ban early in the fall that to the Supreme Court decision just days ago, the ending of DACA, the ending of TPS, zero tolerance, sharp rise in family separations, scaling back conditions for asylum, massive deportations, and in that context, congressional inaction. Our Congress has not been able to come together to find any sort of solution. To be sure, this charged political environment is having a direct impact on our families, on our communities, on our schools, and on our institutions in our neighborhoods. To be sure, much of the debate, much of the action here takes place at the national level, and for many of us, right, many of us feel powerless to address this 30,000-foot level conversation, right? It's a great distance from all of us, and our policymakers will tell us that change takes time. And certainly if we think historically, any progressive change in this country has taken years, if not decades, to accomplish. They'll also tell us that the policymaking process is incremental, right? Baby steps by baby steps. And it seems like we're taking one step forward these days to take 2 steps backwards. But the situation feels urgent, and these ideas, right, that change takes time, we understand that, right, at a distance. But these ideas don't square with the everyday reality of kids and families in our community, right, who have to carry out their everyday lives, right, who struggle to make ends meet, who are fearful and anxious going to school or driving to work, right? Kids who are trying to concentrate on their studies but worried about their parents, right? So while much of this is happening at the national level, to be sure, right, reverberations are being felt locally, right? In the state of Massachusetts, we have nearly 8,000 DACA beneficiaries of an estimated 19,000 undocumented immigrant young people in our state, right? The broader population, about 210,000 undocumented members in our communities across the state. More than 12,000 TPS holders in our state, right? The vast majority come from El Salvador and from Haiti. There are detention centers in the area, and as has been mentioned before, it is very likely, right, that we'll have people coming through this state, right? People have been paying attention. There was a recent lawsuit filed by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice around BPS, sharing student information with local, state, and national enforcement agencies. There was an East Boston high school student who was recently deported based on the report of a school incident. It was an start of a fight that didn't actually happen, but this was shared with the Boston School Police, shared this with ICE. And the student, one of our students, right, East Boston student, was deported. Boston ICE officers now have been directed to arrest any undocumented immigrant who shows up for appointments at government offices, right, following the Trump executive order. In January, 7 people from Massachusetts and Rhode Island were arrested during or following their appointments with USCIS. Many were arrested outside of these offices where they were trying to obtain legal status after marrying U.S. citizens. right? This is a national issue, but every single policy that we've talked about tonight is being carried out locally, and people within our communities, in our schools, are really feeling the brunt of this. And while people may not be able to have an effect on what's happening nationally, and there have been some great ideas already about what we can do, about what folks can do, and I was listening to Dan, and I was really inspired by Dan's the traffic stop thing, and I had Arlo Guthrie in my head. Imagine 50 people a day, and so I think that's the spirit. That's really the spirit I think that we're in. I started this work in the early 1990s, and I mentioned that I worked in youth programs, and at the time there was very little science to support best practices. There was a growing demographic of young people coming of age without legal status, and many of the neighborhoods, the town residents, teachers, counselors, social workers, healthcare professionals really had no idea what to do with these young people. Hadn't thought a lot about it. There wasn't the science to really direct people. Things are really different now. We know a lot about the ways in which these enforcement policies are ratcheting up fear and anxiety, producing physical and emotional manifestations of stress. Right? We know what many of our kids are going through in our schools. We know the effects of deportation, of family separation. Right? And so it is time, and I'm merely repeating what others have said, it is time for us to be courageous in our actions, and to really stand by immigrant families. If change takes time, and we think about last legalization in this country was 1986. The DREAM Act was first introduced in 2001. That's 17 years ago, right? And nevertheless, as I said earlier, kids and their families have to carry out their everyday lives day by day by day. And so for teachers, for counselors, for social workers, for healthcare professionals, for attorneys, for police districts, for chambers of commerce, for local institutions, right? How do we think about addressing people at their everyday needs? Of course, there are big, big issues that we need to take care of, right? But people are also in a lot of pain. How do we stand in solidarity with people, and how do we, right, at the local level, right, provide expertise, provide our volunteer hours, our work hours, to ensure that our neighbors, right, the newcomers in our community, can lead better daily lives. Thank you very much.
So thank you everybody for coming. I do want to put in one quick pitch for the community fund. 50% of children appear in nationwide in front of an immigration judge without an attorney. Over 70% of detained people, estimates vary, 50 to 70% of detained people go in front of a judge in handcuffs and no attorney and have to fight their immigration case. We had a client that is trying to get her daughter back, and when she asked for a fingerprint appointment to get her daughter back, she was given January 31st. When I asked as the attorney, she was given, June 16th, July 16th. And then when I had contacts in my email of congressional people because of work I've done in the past, I got them involved. Her appointment is on Monday. You know, this is what happens with attorneys. Lives change. It's a complicated, difficult system to navigate, and without help, people cannot do this alone. So please, whatever you can do to help and give, we appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for coming.